Thank you everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure to speak about one of the most incredible places in the world to me. I feel very fortunate to work on the Eastern Shore of Virginia for the Nature Conservancy. And I've been here for about 9 years as a director of the Virginia Coast Reserve, and I lead a staff of about 14. I'm going to talk to you about the history, a little bit about the history of this program, because it's really important to what we're doing now, how we got started, what is protected here on the Eastern Shore. I'm going to talk to you about the in-depth partnerships, how we're all working together and have been for decades on the Eastern Shore in the Virginia Coast Reserve, and just the scale of success of restoration, of working with communities here, and really talk about all of our work focused in on how we have really a community-driven, nature-based resilience projects here that are really helping this local community of the Eastern Shore, but informing coastal resilience and adaptation at the global level. And I'm going to speak for probably 20-25 minutes, and then we'll be happy to entertain any questions from or comments from those of you who may be familiar with this system or have questions about anything that we talked about. Because I'm just going to give really a high level presentation. And I'd just like to start. I think probably most of you on this call know where in the world I'm talking about, but I give a lot of talks where people say, what is the Eastern Shore of Virginia? What are you talking about? Of course, we're talking about that Delmarva Peninsula, portions of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. We are that Virginia portion. So this 75-mile long peninsula surrounded by the Chesapeake Bay to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. A very rural community, 2 counties, less than 45,000 people living here. I'll talk about the extensive land protection that is here and how that is really driving so much success in restoration and our ability to think about nature-based solutions in terms of resilience. Brownsville Preserve on the map is just to locate where I'm sitting right now. It's the headquarters of the Virginia Coast Reserve. And of course, our land protection, our ownership spans the entire peninsula, but we are here in Nassawadox at Brownsville Preserve. And it's a beautiful place to visit. There is publicly accessible trails. So just to give a little plug for Brownsville Preserve. So another picture of this peninsula, this time talking about the extensive protection. The Nature Conservancy has a 52-year-old history of protection and conservation with our local, our state, and our federal partners. Everyone really is working together. A very unique place and a wonderful place to work because there are so many partners that are working together. Beginning in the early 1970s, the Nature Conservancy and our partners really had an interest in protecting this barrier island system off of the coast of Virginia. Most of it was privately owned. Some of it was already owned by the federal government, Fisherman's Island, the National Wildlife Refuge, and then of course, Assateague Island, Wallops was owned by the federal government. But most of it was held in private hands. And the Nature Conservancy and partners really worked once the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel was built. We saw the writing on the wall that development might envelop these barrier islands, and people before us decided that this was a really important place on Earth to protect. And so in the early 1970s, we began purchasing the barrier islands to the south. And today, this entire barrier island system is uninhabited, except for, of course, the Wallops Flight Facility and a few in-holdings and hunt clubs that are on some of the islands. But it is a very protected area. And then our focus really broadened to include the nearshore marine system, the shoals of the mainland on the bay side, and now what you see in 2022 is really 133,000 total acres protected on this really 75-mile long peninsula. About 40,000 acres are owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy. So when I refer to the Nature Conservancy's Virginia Coast Reserve, I'm speaking of those 40,000 acres. When we think of the Virginia Coast Reserve in its entirety, we're thinking of those 133,000 and all of the water quality and bottom that is protected. So really the largest expanse of coastal wilderness on the eastern United States. So pretty incredible. And this just to sort of give some context about the vastness of the protection here, this extensive land protection and the conservation that we have on the Eastern Shore has really provided an extraordinary base of study for many things. One of them is looking at the positive impact of conservation on rural areas, rural communities, and not just here, but just thinking about it on a worldwide basis. So if you think about like just the direct economic impact of protecting so much land, there are a lot of people here in this very small population that are employed because we have such a protected landscape. We also have a lot of that protected land under conservation easement. So private landowners own the land, and so the counties, Northampton and Accomack counties, still receive tax benefit from those lands. There's also a lot of indirect ways that our conservation lands positively impact our economy here, and that's through ecotourism. We're a growing place for ecotourism. People visit for our nature, to be involved and out in our nature. And then the aquaculture industry, which is pictured here. We have the largest clam aquaculture industry in the country, right here on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. So the really great water quality that we experience is due a lot in part to the extensive conservation, and therefore aquaculture can continue to thrive here on the Eastern Shore. And that's shellfish aquaculture, mostly clams and oysters. And just, with the protection of this vast coastal wilderness, it's just a responsibility that the Nature Conservancy and all of our partners here that have worked with us over the years, we have a responsibility to manage this system for species that rely on the barrier islands, on the marshes, on the mudflats, and the uplands to survive. So we work really hand in hand with these federal, state, local partners, academic partners that are doing research here, and to effectively protect and manage mostly migratory bird habitats and populations at local and regional scales. But we've also this place has played a real integral role in developing and prioritizing and implementing research here that's uncovered information that's really been critical to ensuring the resiliency of many species of concern, like the American oystercatcher pictured here, and like the piping plover. Our research and our management of migratory birds is now, because we have such extensive information over the decades of, when these birds are here, how their populations are being affected by this place, what's going on south and north of here. We really have a lot of good information to help inform things like, sighting for offshore wind. So, we're involved with our partners again in looking at how do we really ensure that what's going on offshore is not negatively impacting these populations. Like, how far are they flying out into the Atlantic? How high are they flying? Will these turbines impact them? So, us being here in this place allows us to really take a look and work with industry partners to answer some of those questions. And Tom mentioned the LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, which is funded through the National Science Foundation and led by the University of Virginia. They're called the VCR LTER, so don't get confused. All these acronyms that we're also used to. But that program has been in place here since the mid-1980s. So that Long-Term Ecological Research Program looking at the effects of climate change on natural systems, since the 1980s. So there is such extensive long-term data looking at the response of this very protected and conserved system to changes, sea level rise, to changes in temperature, any wind-driven changes, as we restore places, oysters and seagrasses, which I'll talk about. How is this system responding? And so this is a place where not only LTER, but many, many research institutions have focused. Probably one of the most studied coastal areas in the world right here on the Eastern Shore. And so we call it a living laboratory. It's here where we can really demonstrate research and applied science, and really how communities can get involved and be a part of this living laboratory. So the marine habitat restoration is one of the successes of this living laboratory. And when I'm talking about marine habitat restoration, for the most part, I'm talking about seagrasses, so eelgrass restoration, and oysters. Our salt marsh system is very much intact and very much thriving. That is more of a protection than it is a restoration. And so I'm talking about eelgrass, and I'm talking about oysters. And because the water quality here is so good, because we have the conditions that are enabling restoration to be successful, we have actually have results of our eelgrass and our oyster restoration at a scale large enough to have an impact. In other words, there's ample habitat that's been restored of these underwater grasses, these seagrasses, and of oysters, that we're actually seeing a state change. We're actually seeing increases in biodiversity, further improved water quality, all of these things that are at scale. So this is the place where we can actually demonstrate very successful restoration because of those enabling conditions. And the best example of that is the fact that we have restored eelgrass back to this system. Long story, but in the 1930s, wasting disease, and then many coastal storms came through and wiped out the eelgrass really along the East Coast, in the Chesapeake Bay and along the East Coast. But on the Eastern Shore, this grass did not have any seed source. It wasn't, even though the water quality conditions were good, it didn't return on its own. And in the late 1990s, scientists from VIMS found a very small patch of eelgrass and thought, as they were working on their restoration techniques with eelgrass, maybe this is the place where we could actually see success. And they continued to further develop this seed dispersal restoration technique. And 20-some years later, we have gone from basically 0 acres of eelgrass in the system to 10,000 acres, and that continues to expand. So it is the world's largest successful seagrass restoration right here on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And of course, with eelgrass restoration, it's that state change. It's those things that are happening because the restoration is at such a scale that we're seeing really important co-benefits. The bay scallops completely disappeared when the eelgrass disappeared in the 1930s. We're working with our research partners to reestablish bay scallops. We're seeing fish sometimes in some areas that are 5 times more abundant than in areas without grass beds. We're seeing higher blue crab densities, and we're seeing further improved water quality in this area. So lots of great co-benefits by restoring, of course, this really important system. It's also an erosion control, and the waves are dampened by these seagrass beds, helping to improve that water quality. These beds are also mitigating climate change because they're sequestering carbon in their above ground and below ground biomass. And as a result, University of Virginia has developed a seagrass blue carbon methodology to really quantify how much carbon is being stored in this seagrass system right here on the Eastern Shore. And by the end of the year, we will actually have the very first validated and verified seagrass blue carbon project. In other words, we will actually have blue carbon credits to sell on the voluntary market. So if you think, and that's a subset of that 10,000 acres, that project's site is a subset. But if you think about the extent of this restoration, this almost 10,000 acres, in 20 years, that's a lot of carbon that's been captured by these underwater grasses. So a real success story in terms of carbon sequestration as well. And I could talk to you about oyster restoration and the success we've had as an example as well. I'm going to save the oyster restoration as I talk about coastal resilience and how we've moved from successful oyster restoration into oyster restoration for adaptation and resilience. But let's step back and talk about the Virginia Eastern Shore. So we're known for a lot of things. We're the most studied. We have the most successful seagrass restoration project on the planet. But we're also one of the nation's most threatened coastal regions. And that's not news to anyone on this call. I mean, we all live in this region where we're seeing, incredible increases in sea level rise rates. We're seeing more, frequent storms. We're seeing the impact of tidal and inland flooding. All of those, of course, are affecting this peninsula of the Eastern Shore. And so I'll just play this really short video.
We've seen more Category 5 hurricanes in the last several years than we've ever seen before. We're having floods occurring on many high tides, and in a decade, floods will probably occur on every high tide in the Norfolk Hampton Roads areas.
I honestly do not have any conception of what it's going to be like 20 years from now, 30 years from now. My only fear is it seems over the years to be progressing more than it was predicted 10 years before that.
So there's a new reality that we have to live with, and we can't just learn from the past. We have to be able to create new models and new understandings in order to forecast what may happen in the future so that we can make better decisions.
Not news to this crowd, I'm sure, but just hearing the voices of our partners and our community to talk about this place and the impacts that we're seeing. And so I would say, as we call ourselves a living laboratory, we are a living laboratory here for coastal resilience, showing how nature-based solutions can be part of the solution moving forward as we think about adapting and being more resilient to all these changes due to climate change. And just having such an extensive protected salt marsh system, having undeveloped barrier islands, all of those are nature-based solutions. If you think about the Eastern Shore, when a storm, rolls up the East Coast, there are a lot of times when our barrier island system, our coastal bays, our salt marsh system really protect this peninsula. There are times after a storm where everyone else is being affected by runoff from the storm and flooding, and maybe closed shellfish fisheries because of water quality. And we're still open because this area is really serving as a nature-based solution. So let's talk about other nature-based solutions and really what the Nature Conservancy's role. Like I said, one of the most studied coastal systems in the world. We've got lots of people here doing research, looking at the impacts and the effects of these changes over time, looking at the impact of what happens when you restore 10,000 acres of eelgrass. How does a system change? What does that really mean? Our role is really twofold in terms of coastal resilience, and that is, how do we help our communities become more resilient with the threats of climate change by connecting them with the needed resources. And that's, the information, all of the models and the future scenario planning, and that all the data that we've collected over the decades can inform. And money, how do we help these really rural, vulnerable populations and communities? How do we make sure that they have the best information and the best plan moving forward? And the second role of the Nature Conservancy is to help in really demonstrating how nature can play a role. How can nature-based solutions, how do we demonstrate them? How do we implement them at scale so that we really are using nature for coastal resilience? And this slide is oyster castles. And many of you, I'm sure, know and have seen these oyster castles. And of course, they're used as a substrate for restoration. And we've had great success doing oyster restoration using shell piles and using artificial substrates like oyster castles. And our focus, in the very beginning of that effort was to do oyster restoration to improve that fishery so that all the benefits of oysters were in the system. They're filtering water, they're providing, three-dimensional structures for biodiversity, for reefs. And then as we moved on, we really realized that these oyster reefs could really play a role in terms of resilience. So, how do we place them in front of eroding marshes? Of course, those marshes are protecting our coastal communities. How do we protect those marshes with this nature-based solution? How high should these oyster castle arrays be? How long should they be? How much connection with the marsh system should they have? All of those things are part of the research, but also in helping us to implement these nature-based solutions. So different shorelines, we've realized, there's different sediments, and sorry about the sun streaming in, different shorelines that are, have really firm sediments, some have very soft sediments. There's different levels of erosion and how much, slope we have along these marsh edges. And so, we're really trying to figure out what kinds of substrate work the best along what types of marsh shorelines. And of course, we use lots of volunteers in all of our programs. And this is a slide showing volunteers putting together those oyster castles in front of a marsh near Wachapree. And then we're looking at different, and this is a really great slide showing sort of how that, when that calm day turns into a raging sea, or a sea that is at least beating against these marsh edges, and the impact it has. How can we place these are called oyster catcher substrates. They were developed by someone in North Carolina. How do we place these in an area where the oysters will grow, and that vertical accretion and that growth will provide this structure, this reef, this breakwater basically, so that our marshes are not only not being inundated with that daily beating from the waves, but actually maybe can begin to accrete behind them. So that's a big study. And the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is currently funding that project. And you can see the project location in Wachapree. Again, when I say that marsh that we are working along the shoreline is protecting Wachapree, you can see that I really mean it. I mean, that is really what is one of the last marsh islands that is between the Atlantic Ocean, the Barrier Islands, and this community of Wachapree. And so we're trying to demonstrate and at the same time protect this marsh so that it does not further erode, and it actually begins, hopefully, to build itself back up and sustain itself as a functioning salt marsh along the thing. So we're working with our partners here from UVA and looking at where to place different substrates and how that is having an impact on the waves and the currents, how that's having impact on the marsh regrowth behind it, looking at what's going on in the sediments and all of those areas. So just showing you sort of how that works, that project. And if you don't know anything about the communities on the Eastern Shore, we're not that many people. We're less than 45,000 people, but we're very diverse, and we're diverse racially, we're diverse politically, economically, but every single person on the Eastern Shore, every community is feeling the effects of climate change. And as this newspaper article says, we're anxious, we're a little scared, what is coming? And our role as the Nature Conservancy is how can we, in an equitable way, connect these really vulnerable rural communities, populations with resources? How can we demonstrate how to use these nature-based solutions, show how important it is that we have these intact coastal systems, and how do we connect them with funding and planning to be able to be more resilient into the future. And one of the ways that we've worked with the community is we've developed the Eastern Shore of Virginia Coastal Resilience Tool. And it's a platform that is owned by the Nature Conservancy. And it really, we customize it for local areas. And we were able to do that for the Eastern Shore of Virginia because of the extensive data and the models that exist that can help us really provide future scenarios, looking at what would happen if a low intensity, moderate intensity, high intensity storm hits this area, hits a certain place in this area, 20 years from now when sea level rise has increased. Looking at storms and just daily inundation, all of those things. So this customized tool is really helping the community think about future scenarios, thinking about how they plan for infrastructure. Do we raise roads? Do we move schools? What about emergency systems? So it's not just about the nature, it's also about these communities and the infrastructure that supports them, which is really important. And I'm going to wrap up. Well, I did want to tell you about, just this whole helping these communities get the resources, the funding they need, so they're planning. And right now, we're also being funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and Northampton County is being funded by the Coastal Flood Preparedness Fund, Community Flood Preparedness Fund, to create with the community of Oyster with a capital O, how do we help the community of Oyster develop a plan that helps them think about projects, prioritizes projects that will create a more resilient community going into the future. So all of the nature-based solutions, possibly moving of infrastructure, making sure that the community boat ramp is available to people who are working watermen, all of those things that go into creating a community plan. We're working with the community of Oyster. And I just didn't want to, talk about working with the community without saying that it's a long-term goal to continue to always work with this and be part of this community. We are part of this community. We're not just solely focused on the resilience and vulnerability, but we are reaching thousands of Eastern Shore students annually. We're doing field experiences for all the 5th, all the 7th, and all the 10th graders on the Eastern Shore. So getting them out into the marshes, into their backyard, out to the 10th graders go out to a barrier island and do lots of different data collection and studies and field experiences. So really important hands-on programs that we're doing. So that is where I'll stop and stop sharing.
Thanks, Joe. Hey, in the audience, you've been very attentive. We've got time for some questions. You can either type a question in the chat, raise your hand, or if you're one of the usuals, jump right on in. Let's see. What do we got? Got a pretty good crowd today.
All questions were answered.
Don't be shy. We started off, and you returned several times, so I'll throw one out there, talking about the eelgrass wasting disease. And, I am definitely no biological oceanographer, but, I think that's somewhat symptomatic. And it strikes me coming back from something that was, maybe devastating. 1933 was the Chesapeake's worst recorded hurricane in history. It was a couple of storms, but the Chesapeake Potomac hurricane was also like the storm of record for flooding. I think it's about 11 foot at Sewell's Point tide gauge in Norfolk. That meant water all over like downtown Norfolk and Granby Street. So I guess I'm kind of coming around to a question about, is it restored? Is it better than it was prior to the wasting disease, or what's the goal with that kind of restoration?
It's a really good question. And we've created with our research partners a lot of models and thinking about, what was the historical extent of the eelgrass, where can it be restored, and right now that 10,000 acres is really in the southern portion of the coastal bays. So we've only really restored a very small portion of the coastal bays. We have the idea right now to expand that into other areas, and one of those is right around the Wachapreague area. So, how do we expand this to other parts of the system where historically grasses did survive? If you know anything about these coastal bay systems, it's really hard for seeds or plants to make their way up into the system. So if the water quality is good, and if we can employ that same seed restoration technique in areas where historically grass grew, conditions, the bottom, the water quality is good, then we're going to continue to expand that restoration.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'd see a lot of GIS used in that area. A couple people in the chat come from Virginia Beach, where Back Bay's got some analogous history. How about anyone else? See, John, you're...
Yeah, I thought I would jump in and ask a very general question to Jill about the barrier islands, and how do you choose between stabilizing the barrier islands and the various waterways that people use versus allowing the system to go back to marsh grass and drift around the way it's going to anyway? And I know that's kind of a sprawling question, but is there a philosophy for how you armor or not, or protect and so forth? But maybe you can respond to that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we do not. We manage the barrier islands naturally, and so, as I said, there's not a whole lot, very little infrastructure left on these islands. There's a few hunt clubs, there's a few old Coast Guard buildings, but for the most part, these islands are moving and acting in a natural way.
Right.
Right now, they're keeping up with sea level rise. Like overall, our barrier island system is probably seeing like no net loss, but there are some islands that we're seeing big losses, in area, and some islands that are holding their own or are continuing to grow. It depends where you're talking about in the system. But our philosophy, the way that we manage the barrier islands is to allow them to naturally migrate and naturally act as natural migrating, moving barrier island system. That isn't to say that we're not thinking about other ways as the impacts of climate change become greater, like making sure that thinking about the marsh platform that the islands need to roll over onto to allow them to survive as they roll. Are we losing that too quickly, and do we need to enhance that and restore that? So there's researchers at BIMS who are looking at that. But armoring is not something that I say that the Nature Conservancy or our partners are interested in thinking about.
Yeah, if I may follow up, I may have mentioned barrier islands too specifically. I guess what I'm thinking about is the communities, Wachapreague and so forth, will need some level of protection or moving or moving inland and so forth. So I guess my question was more in that regard. The barrier islands aren't inhabited, so or very lightly. So what happens with inhabited areas along the eastern shore? Maybe you can comment about that, please.
Yeah, so every community, of course, is different, and they're experiencing effects differently. They have different infrastructure to protect, a different culture, a different way of thinking about it. And our role as the Nature Conservancy is really to help them with thinking about that, thinking about putting the right data in their hands so they can look at future scenarios, know what to prioritize. Do we move this road? There's 3 roads into Wachapreague. Which one needs to stay viable, for for the community? You know, are there structures that are in harm's way that we need to move out of the flood zone? How do we do that? And what happens to the property that is left behind? How is that restored to help, you know, further our resiliency? So I would say that seaside and bayside are very different. I would say every community is experiencing it very differently. And our role is to help these communities get the resources, that data, the future scenarios, and funding so they can plan projects and have a real sense of, you know, what it's going to look like for them, what they're going to need in a decade, in 20 years, and 50 years, and 100 years.
Yeah, I encourage the discussing it with the community, because so often, you know, the guys with suits to parachute in and say, here's what we're going to do, boys and girls. And I think it's compelling that you're letting the community participate.
You know,
anyway, thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
Please.
and just, you know, just to be clear, like, you know, we are part of this community. I mean, the Nature Conservancy owns more land on the Eastern Shore than any other entity. And you know, so we have a real vested interest. We also live and work here. This is totally community driven.
Mhm.
You are absolutely right. It's not come in and tell local communities what to do. It's listen to what communities need and help them find those resources.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And I'll take one from the chat. Kind of answered our first question, but on what are the top actions with those communities? What are you hearing as priorities? I hear things about septic systems and you know, water quality, but what are your actions and, you know, kind of the pain points for communities?
Yeah. Well, every community is very different. As I said, if you're on the Bayside, you have different needs. If you're in the northern Bayside with a huge salt marsh system, you have very different needs than southern Bayside that are up on bluffs. You know, there's erosion problems in both cases, but you know, we're losing marshes. So I would say there's a lot of different things, but I think from the community we hear a lot of it right now is access in and out of what we call the necks of the Eastern Shore, those, you know, those roads off of 13. How are we going to maintain access, you know, to schools and emergency transport? How are we just going to get to work every day? I mean, we have schools as you all do in Norfolk. How do we keep our schools open? And what does that look like? All the way to farmers seeing portions of their land being underwater, and you know how that's impacting their bottom line. So it runs the whole gamut on the Eastern Shore. It's protecting infrastructure, it's protecting private lands, it's protecting public lands and access. All of those things are of consequence here.
Very good. Who else has one? Let's looking at chat. Raise your hand or unmute and jump right on in.
Okay, this is John again. I'll ask, are you able to export your plans and ideas to other areas with the same sort of ocean encroachment?
It's a great question. And typically that is the highlight of what I talk about. I was talking more about our community driven work, but you know, it's that local to global. Yes, we definitely are. And there's many ways we do that. I mean, the fact that, you know, our partnerships and the longevity of these partnerships are so long and deep is really something. So we're sort of regionally transporting that knowledge just because we work with so many people around the state, around the Bay watershed, around, you know, the Northeast, all of those things. The Nature Conservancy is a global organization. So we have, you know, networks and community of practices where we're all sort of thinking about how do we look at systems that are similar to the Virginia Coast Reserve and apply some of the successes with our restoration. if we don't have the water quality in those areas, how do we get to the good water quality so that we can begin to restore oysters and seagrasses and things like that? So, we physically see people from all over the world at the Virginia Coast Reserve, all of the time. Study groups, people, farmers from Africa. We've had groups that are looking to do oyster restoration in Europe. We've had people from Australia and New Zealand looking at the success we're having. And so being able to use the academic networks, they're doing research here and publishing papers, all the way to just creating this place where people can learn from how we're also doing this community-driven resilience work. So it is definitely one of the top priorities of this program, is to export what we're learning and share and learn from others as well.
Thank you.
Oh, let's have another. Let's see. Robert.
Hi, I had a question in the chat about this Eastern Shore area may be unique in that the population is stable, or maybe it's even decreasing. That's a lot different than a lot of coastal areas, resort areas, where the increase in population puts a good stress on the ecosystems. Do you have any comment on that? Are you worried about population increases on the Eastern Shore and problems associated with that?
Maybe before you got on, we were talking about two things to keep the population down, and I'm just being really flip when I say this, but we have a really huge toll on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, and we have lots of mosquitoes, right? So that's just a joke. Of course, we think about that. We also have a limited amount of fresh water from our aquifers. We have a lot of limiting factors, but we do think about growth. I mean, we've become a real epicenter for ecotourism. We've become, during the pandemic, the amount of visitors and tourists that we had on the Eastern Shore was pretty epic for us. So we think about that a lot, like any coastal area. We are not seeing an increase in population right now. In fact, you're right. Like Northampton County, I believe, is either stable or we actually lost a few people. We have less than 12,000 people living in Northampton County, so very, very small. And we don't also have the riverine input that other communities do. So we don't have the runoff into our coastal bay side, even on the bay side, as other places do. So sure, we think about it, like, what the impact would be, but right now, the main driver is not, that our population is increasing.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask, someone else chatted with me about that, about education role, and a couple of people I know on the shore have mentioned the word brain drain, about people leaving the shore but not coming back. And I don't know if that's a phenomena. I mean, the other side of it, there is opportunity with the spaceport and high tech and bandwidth, the new economy. How do you think that fares? We can bring some hydrone and drones over there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, education is part of it. Connection to this place. You're right. There is, I think, an issue with opportunity, and young people not staying on the Eastern Shore because there might not be opportunity. I mean, there's agriculture and aquaculture, and there's the conservation field. And then otherwise, there's of course the education systems, and so there's not, but we are a program of the Nature Conservancy that actually has in our strategic planning that we want to help with retaining teachers, and we want to help connect young people with this place so that they stay here. Like that's sort of not what the Nature Conservancy's mission is all about, but because this is such a special place. It's really important that we are connected to the community, and more importantly, that the community is connected to this natural environment. It's very unique. And so it's really important for us to do that.
And another person asked, do you have internship opportunities?
Always. Yep. Seasonal positions, internship positions, all of our land protection, our seagrass restoration, our oyster restoration, our migratory bird program, our community outreach. We're always different times of year hiring. Nature.org is our website for the Nature Conservancy globally, and that is where all those opportunities are posted.
All right. Awesome. Well, I'm going to make out the last call. I know Daniel's out there thinking about a question. Come out. No pressure.
I mean, we
Anyone
can
else?
take the hydrone out there if you want to.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not a question. That's a let's do it.
Learn by doing.
That's right.
Awesome. Alrighty. Well, I'm not seeing others, so we're gonna disperse for Halloween for those who care to celebrate. And thank you again, Jill, for a very awesome talk. Gets a couple of us very anxious to get over there and visit sometime.